in the air, but it soon warms up as the sun gets to work, and in the east of Scotland, southern Scotland, for much of England and Wales, we'll see sunny spells continuing into the afternoon. A few showers turn up for northern England and southern Scotland, but the showers that we start the day with in western Scotland turn to more persistent rain by the afternoon, perhaps brushing the north of Northern Ireland as well. 13 to 14 Celsius in Scotland and Northern Ireland, 15 to 16 in the south of England and Wales, where we keep the light winds and with those sunny spells, although a chilly start to the day, well, it turns out to be reasonably warm by the afternoon. Into the evening, and we keep the clear spells for much of central and southeastern UK, and again with light winds, temperatures will fall away, low single figures in places by dawn. But further north and west, thicker cloud arrives, outbreaks of rain as well, and a freshening breeze. So of course here, milder with 10 to 12 Celsius more likely as we start off Wednesday. It is a damp start for much of Scotland, especially through the central belt, some heavy rain for a time. Northern Ireland clears the wet weather, pushes into northern England then by early afternoon, and Wales sees some outbreaks of rain. But the front fizzles out by the time it reaches central parts of the UK. There'll be some sunshine ahead of it and brighter skies to follow it for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Then the weather turns much more unsettled on Thursday and Friday, a strengthening wind with the risk of gales in places, spells of heavy rain, particularly in the west, followed by lively showers on Friday and Saturday.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Television and your radio. Today, Parliament is back. Yes, after that conference recess, that hiatus, MPs are back on those green benches. So we've got a lot to explore today. Not only the government's growth strategy, Treasury questions, of course, solar panels, the SNP's conference, but also, what on earth is the AntiGrowth Coalition? All that to come after the headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. The Prime Minister is going to urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks later. The Ukrainian president is going to join the virtual meeting of world leaders. It's after Russia launched its biggest attack in months. Missile strikes hit the capital, Kyiv, and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Air raid sirens have been heard again this morning amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. The Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng's going to appear in the Commons later to face questions from MPs about his economic plans. The Bank of England is further bolstering its emergency bond buying plan in a bid to try to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed a material risk to the UK's financial stability and have acted in an effort to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. Supreme Court judges will begin hearing arguments later to determine if the Scottish Parliament can hold an independence referendum without the support of Westminster. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing, with the UK government expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the ONS showed the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. We're on your TV, we're online and on your DAB+ radio. It's GB News. Now let's head back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Parliament returns today after a long conference recess. As we speak, the Cabinet is meeting in number 10 to no doubt review the strategy ahead of what was meant to be a very busy few weeks and a flurry of announcements. How much has market turmoil changed those plans? Well, we'll have to wait and see. Another key, more public point today is at 2:30 p.m. when the Chancellor will take to his feet in the Commons for his first Treasury questions. Now, given how much focus there's been on his mini-budget and yesterday's announcement that the further medium-term fiscal plan will now be set out on the 31st of this month, Halloween, this will certainly be one to watch. And over in Labour land, left-wing MP Sam Tarry was last night deselected in favour of a more centrist candidate in his Ilford North seat. Now, Tarry has indicated he may well challenge this deselection. We'll keep an eye on this throughout the day. But before we dive into the wide-ranging events of today, let's look back at the final party conference of conference recess. With a Supreme Court judgment expected today on Nicola Sturgeon's ability to force a second referendum rerun in Scotland, Darren McCaffrey has been exploring the SNP conference in Aberdeen.
In Scotland, the battle for the future of Britain has not gone away. After success in last year's Holyrood elections, the SNP argued they're determined not to give up on the hope of independence.
Whether it's Tory or Labour, Labour or Tory, it's not us who gets to decide. Our votes don't determine who gets to occupy number 10. For Scotland, the problem is not just which party is in power at Westminster. The problem is Westminster.
But ultimately, the decision for a second referendum is currently not theirs to take. That's why the battle is moving to London and to hear the UK's Supreme Court, who will decide if MPs at Westminster or MSPs in Edinburgh should have the final say on another vote.
But what if the decision doesn't go their way? Well, that leaves Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP with two big problems. First of all, what do they do next, particularly when the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has made it clear that she thinks there shouldn't be another vote anytime soon? And second of all, while the polls are pretty divided on independence, evenly split, only a third of Scots think that now is the right time for another referendum.
A lot of people expect the Supreme Court to rule against that, and if that's the case, she said that she'll try to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum. Whether she can actually do that, I mean, who can, after all, decide what is the issues of an election campaign. So there's doubts over whether it actually will be a de facto referendum. But I think what Nicola Sturgeon is maybe trying to do on that as well is to retain relevance, to try to ensure that her supporters don't vote for Labour instead. So by raising the issue of independence, she might be able to hold on to those pro-independence votes.
But for most SNP activists, Nicola Sturgeon must not relent.
We will use the Westminster election, the next Westminster election. If the Supreme Court says no, that will be used as a plebiscite referendum. We have that right under international law.
Are you frustrated, though?
With the UK government, absolutely. As she said at the weekend, if they are so confident, why not just let it go ahead?
What should she do next? What do you want to see her do next?
Well, she said she's going to use it for the next general election.
Do you think that's going to work, though?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. But I hope so. But let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says. Then we'll make a judgment, I think.
For the moment, focus will now be on the Supreme Court's hearing. With a judgment due to take months, this drawn-out battle is not likely to conclude anytime soon, to the frustration of nearly everyone on every side of the debate. Darren McCaffrey, GB News, Aberdeen.
Well, thanks to Darren for that report. And of course, we'll be keeping a keen eye on whatever the Supreme Court may say later today. It will certainly be one to watch. But moving on to energy now. The Prime Minister in her leadership election campaign repeatedly criticised the installation of solar panels on farmland. And now the government is reportedly considering measures to curb the rollout of this fast-growing technology, despite reservations from Jacob Rees-Mogg's business department, leaving BEIS, as it's known, and the Environment Department, DEFRA, at loggerheads. Industry bosses have warned that around £20 billion of investment could be at risk if a solar farm ban on agricultural land goes ahead. But is it really going to go ahead? What are the arguments here? I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hewitt, who's Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, joining me live from Westminster. Thank you so much for making the time this morning, Chris. I suppose the first question here is how big a sector could solar farms be in this country? This country's not seen to be particularly sunny, and there is the argument that there's a food security issue. Does the government have a point in saying that perhaps we're not best suited to mass solar farms?
Well, solar technology has been a global success story. The costs of generating power from solar have fallen by 90% since 2010. And yes, the economics of solar work equally well in the UK as it does in the rest of Europe and most of the world. So that's really not an issue. The food security issue is also really a misnomer. Even if we were to build as much solar as required for the net zero targets by 2050, we only need 0.5% of the UK land base, which is a very small percentage. So it's really not a food security threat.
Why then do you think that the government is exploring this? I mean, we do understand that there are differences of opinion within the government. The business department much more in favour of letting people do what they want with their land, but the Environment Department suggesting that there may be this expansion of definition of agriculturally important land where a ban may be enforced. Why then, if solar is so much cheaper now, and indeed, if solar is desirable for the UK climate, why is this ban being considered?
That's a question for the government. We're a little baffled why this is the case. It seems to be that the Department for Rural Affairs is talking about forcing farmers to only grow food on some of their less productive land. It's really, we all agree that solar shouldn't be going on the most productive land, and solar doesn't go on grade 1 or grade 2. But 3B is a large proportion of flat areas of the country which are very suitable for solar and less suitable for a lot of food growing. The other point to make is that agriculture is often integrated with solar, so we will see grazing on a lot of solar farms in the UK, and particularly on that 3B land.
Do you talk to many farmers in your role as Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK? Do you get a sense of what farmers want to do with their land? Because it does seem peculiar, as if there's sort of artificial lines being drawn up here between those who want energy and those who want farming. Because surely I would suppose farmers who are putting solar panels on their land, or who are applying to do so, want to put solar panels on their land.
Absolutely, by definition, they wouldn't be making those applications if they didn't want to do so. We do talk to a lot of farmers, and our members obviously talk to a lot of farmers. We find that what happens is the solar revenues are supporting their farming business. It's giving them an extra diversification of revenues. It supports them sort of producing food in other parts of their land. So the NFU have been very clear that they support solar. The Country Landowners Association are very clear they don't want to see Grade 3B land declared best and most versatile. So it's actually hard to find any organisation within the farming community who's in favour of what DEFRA seems to be proposing.
Extraordinary. I wonder, in this show we'll be talking a little bit more about what Liz Truss called the AntiGrowth Coalition a little bit later on in the show. I wonder, Chris Hewitt, if you would be so bold as to suggest that perhaps those who suggest a ban on solar farms in this country would be contributing to a so-called anti-growth coalition.
I think that's a fair point. It is something we've said. So there's 20 billion of investment which is at threat here, and we have an energy security crisis driven by the price of gas. So the more solar we build, the cheaper we can drive our energy bills, and that's going to increase our energy independence, it's going to increase our economy, and it's going to support lower bills. So it really is quite baffling why the government would make these moves. And well, I suspect they won't in the end. I think the Treasury's view on this will be very interesting, because the Treasury, of course, is now subsidising a lot of the energy generation in the country. They know that the more clean, cheap, private capital invested renewables we get on the system, the lower that cost will be to themselves and the taxpayer.
Now, I suppose one of the big arguments against solar, and indeed against wind, is that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Is it sensible for this country to base so much of its energy needs on what is, frankly, an intermittent source of power?
You'd be surprised to know that maybe the developers of wind and solar do know exactly what the weather patterns are, and it's a very predictable source of energy. Interestingly, the wind and solar actually do tend to balance each other out. So when there's high pressure in this country, there's generally clear skies, so you get more solar, so that helps. We also need energy storage, we also need other forms of balancing technologies. And in the short term, we will need those fossil fuels to fill the gaps, but we only really want the fossil fuels to fill the gaps where we can't get cheap renewables. And the speed with which renewables will be deployed, both offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, is quite sort of breathtaking, and I think we will see a reduction of dependence on gas very, very quickly over the next decade.
Well, it's a really, really fascinating issue, and interesting to hear that the NFU and lots of farmers who, of course, are applying for these things actually do support solar on agricultural land or on the less intensively used agricultural land. This will be a very, very interesting one to follow. But for now, Chris Hewitt, Chief Executive of Solar Energy UK, thank you so much for joining me live from Westminster. Now, to a phrase that the Labour Party has been sharing a lot on social media. A new soundbite popping up across speeches and adverts. A soundbite that has, as of yet, not been fact-checked by any leading fact-check service here in the UK. The claim that in the last few weeks the Tories have, quote, crashed the economy. The claim has had millions of impressions and has been used by leading Labour politicians. It's clearly part of Labour's new soundbite checklist. But is it true? Has there been an economic crash in this country? In what sense has the economy crashed, if so? Is GDP down? Has inflation suddenly shot further up? Has the stock market had a sudden, sharp crash? Is unemployment up? Well, let's look at each of these indicators in turn. On the 30th of September, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, announced that GDP, far from going down, has been revised upwards for the second quarter of this year, avoiding a second month of negative growth. In technical terms, avoiding a recession. So, in fact, unlike the United States, which is in technical recession, the UK has in fact avoided that recession, far from an economic crash. And on inflation, the largest measure in the mini-budget, the energy price guarantee, is estimated to reduce inflation by up to 5 percentage points this year. The stock market, for its part, has not faced a sudden jolt of the sort associated with an economic crash. And just today, the ONS has announced that the unemployment rate is the lowest it has been for nearly 50 years. Indeed, the ONS has also found that spending is up in almost all sectors, save for pubs, restaurants and fast food, in the week to the 2nd of October this year. Recent data that's far from an economic crash. And even on the currency, the pound is trading this morning at $1.10. By comparison, the euro is trading at just 97 cents. People feared that the currency would, like the euro, reach parity with the dollar. And it emphatically has not. In short, this country has not faced an economic crash. Well, I'm glad that we could get those facts on the table. Let's hope, perhaps, that some fact-checker services will turn as much attention to the statements of the leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister in waiting, as many have started to call him, as they do to the government. But finally this morning, let's turn back to the Tories. And during her conference speech, the Prime Minister lashed out at what she called an anti-growth coalition. She said, and I quote, "I will not allow the anti-growth coalition to hold us back. Labour, the Lib Dems and the SNP, the militant unions, the vested interests dressed up as think tanks, the talking heads, the Brexit deniers and Extinction Rebellion, and some of the people we had in the hall earlier today." Well, of course, she was referring to those Greenpeace protesters who tried to disrupt her speech, although who many people said actually bolstered her speech and indeed illustrated that anti-growth coalition. But what does it actually mean? This is a phrase that has come under significant criticism online, people saying that the anti-growth coalition doesn't exist, criticising journalists using the phrase. Let's explore what exactly the anti-growth coalition means now with Sam Ashworth-Hayes, the Director of Studies at the Henry Jackson Society. Sam Ashworth-Hayes, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Firstly, in your view, what is the anti-growth coalition and does it exist?
So I think it definitely exists, and it's a very interesting phrase that's been deployed by Liz Truss in this speech. And it kind of calls back to something the American economist Manker Olson wrote, which basically says that, a stable society which is prosperous and exists for a long time will sort of accumulate vested interest, which will then use their position to veto potential disruption to that position. And you can see this tendency in British politics. You can see, very clearly in planning, people trying to stop houses being built, which will disrupt the value of their own house prices. You can see it when people sort of block factories going through. You can see it when people block infrastructure. The problem for Liz Truss is that the anti-growth coalition was absolutely in the room with her, and it probably consists of her members. If you look at the by-election results in Cheshire and Amersham, the Liberal Democrats basically hooved up Conservative votes by attacking the idea that homes need to be built. If you look at previous Conservative manifestos, Liz Truss is sitting there saying, why aren't we building infrastructure? Well, you can go back to 2010, you can go back to the 2010 manifesto, and who was promising to stop the third runway at Heathrow? Who was promising to block plans for second runways at Stansted and Gatwick? Well, it's the Anti-Growth Coalition, and the Anti-Growth Coalition happens to be your party.
So, Sam Ashworth-Hayes, when it comes to the Anti-Growth Coalition, it's interesting looking at so much of the commentary online. It's fair to say, to some extent, there are many Conservative MPs who are part of this coalition too.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Because they are very aware of where their voting base is, and their voting base is generally opposed to disruption in the form of building houses, building infrastructure in the area. And quite often, I think it's sort of worth noting, because the Conservative base is becoming so much more elderly than the rest of the population, it tends not to benefit quite so much from investments now, which pay off quite a long time in the future, although it does bear the costs in terms of associated disruption. And it doesn't really, to the same extent as perhaps the Labour base might, which is much younger, benefit from increase in wages and productivity because, well, they're not so likely to be working. They're going to be, they're economically inactive retirees. So I think there's a sort of pressure on Conservative MPs to do things which are not particularly good for growth. At the same time, of course, if you want to support high living standards for people who are economically inactive, you need that high growth to pay for that. So it's sort of it's a real sort of dilemma for them. But they tend to come down on the fact that in their local area, what will lose you votes the fastest is building lots of housing or building new infrastructure or doing these things which are quite disruptive to their local voters. I think it's also sort of worth mentioning as well, this is the same party which, while sort of being slated for these tax cuts or cancelled tax increases in the mini budget, the tax burden is still going to be at its highest sustained level since the 1950s, which is not a particularly pro-growth thing. And when this trust turns around and says it's disgraceful as an AntiGrowth Coalition running the country, well, who's been in Downing Street all this time?
Yeah, really, really interesting points there. I suppose we'll have to look as to whether or not so much ire is turned on Liz Truss's own backbenchers as it has been on the benches opposite. I hasten to worry that actually, given party management issues, those battles may well be ducked, but I suppose it will be one to watch. Sam Ashworth-Hayes, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really fascinating topic of discussion there. But in other news, new figures, of course, this morning reveal that rising cost of funerals is forcing many to borrow money to give their loved ones a good send-off. And in many cases, people are having to abandon the idea of a funeral altogether. Well, our South West of England reporter Jeff Moody has been to meet a funeral director who's concerned about those rising costs of dying.
The polished hearses, the fresh flowers, the coffin. The way we say goodbye doesn't come cheap, and when you throw in rising energy and fuel prices, the cost of dying is the highest it's ever been. Michael Peace is part of a family firm of undertakers in Hampshire that has been providing services to the community for over 60 years.
On our premises here, we've got a number of refrigeration units that we have to run continuously to look after deceased in the appropriate and the best manner. And so those costs are going up. And of course, we have to sometimes pass those things on to the client.
The average price of a funeral has now tipped £4,000. But in a new report from Sun Life, 1 in 5 say they are shocked at how expensive a funeral is. A third of people haven't saved enough for their own funeral, and many are now taking out loans or opting for a no-frills cremation, without fuss, without ceremony, without mourners.
And for example, the crematorium here locally may do what's called a direct cremation service, so that keeps the cost to a minimum as well. I think that they're an extremely good option for people who are concerned about what they're spending on funerals, but are able to do it in a dignified and professional way.
But there is a concern. Funerals are part of the whole grieving process, from the cars to the flowers to the coffin. And the worry is, if you dispense with too much of that, you're not grieving properly, and you're storing up trouble for the future.
But obviously one of the challenges, and I think we saw this quite clearly with the Queen's funeral recently, is there is a desire on the part of lots of people to say farewell or pay their respects in person. And actually that can be quite helpful for the grieving process. So it's very definitely not a choice for everyone.
So says the National Association of Funeral Directors. But there's help at hand. The funeral expenses payment is a one-off means-tested payment designed to support people on benefits. In recent years, protest group Fair Funerals has been urging the government to step in and help further, ensuring everyone has the chance of a dignified farewell.
Don't wait until you're grieving to start thinking and talking to your family about funeral costs, because the fact is that when we are grieving, we're not able to act very often as savvy consumers. So unfortunately, we can end up spending more than we can afford on funerals.
Debt and rising costs are a huge part of our lives at the moment. The hope is those debts don't become a part of our deaths too. Jeff Moody, GB News.
Well, thanks to Jeff for that report. Coming up, it's To The Point with Mercy and Inaya. And of course, I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9:30 with so much more on what's going on in politics this week. Up next, though, it's the weather.
Hello, good morning. I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Chilly start out there for some of us, but sunny spells in the south will carry on into the afternoon, whilst further north, cloudier skies and some outbreaks of rain. Those outbreaks of rain, mainly showery at first, but turning more persistent as a number of weather fronts move in from the Atlantic. But ahead of those weather fronts, well, for much of England and Wales, it's a sunny start to the day. In some sheltered spots, certainly a chill in the air, but it soon warms up as the sun gets to work. And in the east of Scotland, southern Scotland, for much of England and Wales, we'll see sunny spells continuing into the afternoon. A few showers turn up for northern England and southern Scotland, but the showers that we start the day with in western Scotland turn to more persistent rain by the afternoon, perhaps brushing the north of Northern Ireland as well. 13 to 14 Celsius in Scotland and Northern Ireland, 15 to 16 in the south of England and Wales, where we keep the light winds and with those sunny spells, although a chilly start to the day, well, it turns out to be reasonably warm by the afternoon. Into the evening, and we keep the clear spells for much of central and southeastern UK, and again with light winds, temperatures will fall away, low single figures in places by dawn. But further north and west, thicker cloud arrives, outbreaks of rain as well, and a freshening breeze. So of course here, milder with 10 to 12 Celsius more likely as we start off Wednesday. It is a damp start for much of Scotland, especially through the central belt, some heavy rain for a time. Northern Ireland clears the wet weather, pushes into northern England then by early afternoon, and Wales sees some outbreaks of rain. But the front fizzles out by the time it reaches central parts of the UK. There'll be some sunshine ahead of it and brighter skies to follow it for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Then the weather turns much more unsettled on Thursday and Friday, a strengthening wind with the risk of gales in places, spells of heavy rain, particularly in the west, followed by lively showers on Friday and Saturday.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other pay-per-review shows out there.